You know, I've been around for a while. Met some interesting people. Done some crazy things. So you just might think that there's not much that can take me by surprise. You'd be wrong. The world is full of stories, science and things that amaze and confound me. Every single day, incredible mysteries that keep me awake at night. Some I can answer. Others just defy logic.
Do parallel worlds exist? In New York, a woman has a frightening encounter with a mysterious shadow shaped like a human. Was it an entity from another dimension?
There was something very sinister about it.
In New Jersey, a boy becomes entangled in a strange machine.
On the count of 3, we jump through the field of energy.
And ends up in another world. Does teleportation exist? And in Mexico, an explorer uncovers a bizarre skull made of crystal. Is it a doorway to another universe?
Yeah. It's a weird world, and I love it. Bubbles! Beautiful, aren't they? Well, guess what? Scientists believe that we're living in one. They say that our entire universe is a giant, perhaps infinite-sized one of these. But if that's hard to comprehend, there's something else. In 2010, scientists found something extraordinary. Evidence that our bubble, our universe, has been bruised not once but 4 times. Why? Because it's smashed into other bubbles. And do you know what those other bubbles are? Other universes. There could be millions of them. Parallel worlds. Other dimensions that exist alongside ours. Amazing, isn't it? But let's think about this. If it's true, that means there could be people or something like us floating around inside them. Isn't that a little scary? Could we, in the distant future, bump into something or someone from a neighboring dimension? Well, I've got news for you. It's happening right now. Bubbles!
Rosemary Gilley is an author. In October 2010, she decided to go hiking in the Fahnestock State Park in New York.
So I trekked out by myself, which is not always a good idea. And there was no one around. There was no one on the trail. And I went out to what we call the King's Chamber.
The King's Chamber is one of several mysterious man-made structures in the area.
Nobody really knows who built them or why. And many people who visit them have paranormal experiences.
Some think Native Americans made them. Others believe it was European settlers or even ancient Druids. No one knows for sure, but as Rosemary enters the ruins, she begins to sense something strange.
I could sense an unusual presence there. You have a feeling that there may be something unseen watching you, or that something unusual is about to happen.
Despite her misgivings, Rosemary presses on. It's not long before she's sorry she did.
I became aware of a dark shape moving through the trees in front of me. There was something very sinister about it. This figure was tall and slim, and it looked like the outline of a human being. It was very dark in color, inky dark, and it had very blurry edges, and the lower portion of it sort of trailed away. There's no facial features, no eyes, but yet you know it's looking at you. You can just feel it. And that is a very scary thing.
Was Rosemary's mind playing tricks? Or was someone or something stalking her through the King's Chamber?
And this was not an apparition. You simply know when you are encountering something that's not quite of this world.
So what was it? Rosemary didn't wait around to find out.
It was like one of those movies where bad things are happening to people, and a voice says, "Get out. It's time to go."
What did Rosemary Gillies see? Was she in real danger from a shadow, or was it something even more sinister? Incredibly, her experience is not unique. Hundreds have reported encounters with dark, humanoid, transparent creatures. They call them shadow people. But what are they? Rosemary has come to an incredible conclusion.
Shadow people come from other dimensions, parallel dimensions that are right here on this planet. They're just around a certain bend in space where we can't normally see them except under the right circumstances.
Are shadow people intruders from a parallel dimension? If so, how do they cross into our world? And what do they want? Chris French is a psychologist. He believes there is a simple explanation.
These shadow people are just shadows. The way that these shadow people are said to move is kind of a very fleeting motion. One moment they're there, next moment they're somewhere else. I mean, to me, it sounds very much like the way that shadows move.
Are shadow people simply random shadows? If so, what gives them such distinct human shapes? French believes the answer lies in a phenomenon called pareidolia.
Pareidolia refers specifically to this idea that we can sometimes think we see clear and distinct human forms in what is essentially just random background noise. I think everybody's probably had the experience of looking at patterns on wallpaper and making out faces in those patterns. Or we look up in the clouds and we see animal shapes. People have found images of Christ in plates of spaghetti, in cinnamon buns, in the burn marks on tortillas. What you've got are really kind of more or less random patterns, but we will impose some kind of meaning on them. People tend to experience shadow people in certain kinds of locations. If you're in a forest, if you're in a cave, if you're in somewhere where there's lots of shadows, then those are precisely the kind of random background visual noise situations where you might actually think you can see things that aren't there. And there's probably also the fact that in certain kinds of environments, there are reasons why we might actually feel on edge. So for example, if you went into a cave and there's a very, very high ceiling in the cave, then again, that will tend to make us feel slightly on edge because we don't know what's up there, what might be about to jump on us. And if you think of this from the evolutionary perspective, it makes sense that in certain locations we are more kind of alert, more on guard, more aware of possible threats in the environment than in other places.
But many who have encountered shadow people feel physically threatened. Why?
I think one of the reasons that people often perceive these things as being something potentially threatening is because that's the way we've evolved. In terms of our evolutionary history, then it makes sense that we have cognitive systems that are very much tuned to picking up on possible threats in the environment. And so very often, if we think we can see some kind of form, if we think there's something out there that might do us harm, then it's better to err on the side of perceiving it that way as a potential threat and getting out of any possible danger rather than to take any risks. Some guy back in the Stone Age and he thinks that there might be a saber-toothed tiger in that bush. On the one hand, you've got the guy who very quickly decides it's a saber-toothed tiger and runs away. You've got the other guy who stands there scratching his beard, wondering whether it really is a saber-toothed tiger. He gets eaten. So who's going to pass on their genes? We've evolved to survive.
Are our survival instincts tricking us into believing a shadow is a terrifying and real creature?
It's an extremely common phenomenon for perfectly sane people to sometimes see things that aren't actually there. There are parts of the brain that are hardwired to recognize faces and human forms. And so sometimes those parts of the brain will actually fire when what we're looking at are really just shadows.
Are shadow people simply shadows? Rosemary Gilley isn't convinced.
It was not a trick of my imagination. It was unmistakable, a black shape moving through the trees.
You know, it's amazing how real shadows can appear. But could something like this be a terrifying shadow creature from another dimension that's come to pay us a visit? Did you do that, Fluffy?
So who exactly are shadow people? Where do they come from? One man believes he has the answer.
They belong to a race of beings that predates human beings. They exist in a dimension very close to ours.
A woman has a terrifying encounter with a human-like shadow. Was it a trick of her mind or a visitor from a parallel world? Philip Imbrogno is a paranormal researcher. He thinks the answer is clear.
From the cases that I've studied about shadow people, I believe they are interdimensional in nature. They're intelligent. They belong to a race of beings that predates human beings. They exist in a dimension very close to ours.
It's an incredible theory, but it begs one big question. How can we know these other dimensions exist? Imbrogno believes the answer lies with the force of gravity and its component part, the graviton.
A graviton is a theoretical particle that ties the entire universe together. It blends in with Einstein's theory of special relativity. And one of the things that science could not explain for many centuries is why is gravity the weakest force in the universe? Theoretically, it should be the strongest force. It's not. Now, the particle that is responsible for gravity has been labeled the graviton. Gravitons flow through the dimensions just like a wave. These particles have a pull, like a magnetic pull. The gravity coming from our sun, reaching the Earth, should theoretically tear the Earth apart, but it doesn't. If all of these gravitons being emitted from the sun were filtered through multi-dimensions before they reach us, it could give us an indication that these other extra dimensions do in fact exist.
If that sounds like gobbledygook, here's the simple version. Imbrogno thinks gravity is being weakened as it travels from the sun to Earth because it's being diffused as it passes through, yeah, you guessed it, other dimensions that are home to shadow people. It's an extraordinary and somewhat crazy idea, but if there are other dimensions surrounding ours, how are shadow people traveling between them and to us?
Shadow people may understand the concept of gravitons more than we do. Their technology has been around thousands and thousands of years before human beings. So they may understand that they may have to focus gravitons at a particular area to open up a portal to lead into our reality.
According to Imbrogno, he will soon have hard scientific evidence to support his theory.
When these dimensions are opened up, we should see an influx of gravitons. This interaction can be measured. So the exciting research that I'm involved in right now is building devices that would be able to detect large amounts of gravitons to predict when shadow people would appear.
Are shadow people using gravity to open portals to our dimension? And if so, what do they want?
Their purpose, their agenda may vary depending upon the group of shadow people. I don't think they have one agenda. I don't think they work together as a team. I think they work together more or less in clans or groups. Some of them have certain agendas. Some of them may have different agendas. It seems to me that the main objective of the shadow person's visit is to learn about us as much as they can by observing us. Some people would find that very unsettling. Usually, the prelude to an invasion is going and getting intelligence before you make your move. Some people believe this is what's being done. I would like to think that they just discovered us and they're as curious about us as we are about them. And perhaps someday in the future, they may make their presence known to us and try to coexist with us, since we are neighbors. They are the neighbors we really, very rarely see. The next door neighbor who has a big high fence in which we can't see what they're like. We're trying to find out about them, but we can't violate their privacy. And one day, maybe the neighbor will open up the gate and announce themselves and say, we've been, listening for you for many, many years and we'd like to be friends.
Did Rosemary Gilly encounter a curious shadow person? Are we facing an invasion of beings from a neighboring dimension? Should we be afraid, very afraid? Or are they nothing but a trick of light? Weird. Or what?
I used to get into a lot of sticky situations during our voyage on the Starship Enterprise, but I was always able to get out of them like this. See what I just did there? And I didn't even have Scotty to beam me up. But can we somehow transport ourselves from one location to another in an instant? Things like that are science fiction, right? Wrong.
1960, suburban New Jersey. 6-year-old Andrew Bashiaga was about to have the most incredible day of his life.
My dad called out to my mother and said, "Hon, I'm taking Andy to the hardware store." Instead, he drove me up to the old aeronautical company facility in Woodridge, New Jersey, a large defense technical experimental area that dated back to World War II.
As they enter the facility, Andrew wonders why his father Frank would bring him to a place like this.
I didn't know what was happening.
Andrew's dad leads him to a secret room. Inside is something unlike anything he's ever seen before.
It was so strange. It essentially consisted of 2 elliptical-shaped booms that were about 8 feet tall and about 10 feet across.
It's a machine that's beyond Andrew's comprehension. Whatever it is, his father is clearly in charge. But why? And what is it for?
I had the technician turn the device on.
As Andrew watches, the booms begin to spin, generating a strange cascade of energy.
That looked almost like water falling in a public fountain. It was a very beautiful, sort of shimmering field of energy.
As the energy field from the machine grows, Andrew's dad does something incredible. He tells his son to take his hand, then the unimaginable happens.
We counted down, 1, 2, 3. On the count of 3, we jumped through the field of energy. We seemed to be moving, and I could ultimately see a point of light in the distance. And that light reached us very quickly and accelerated. And when the light hit us, we were elsewhere in the country. Now, my father didn't tell me where we were going. In fact, we were jumping 2,005 miles through this vortal tunnel in the fabric of time-space to the state capitol grounds in Santa Fe, New Mexico.
It's an astonishing claim. Did two humans actually transport from New Jersey to New Mexico in the blink of an eye? What happened to Andrew and his father? Is his story just the wild fantasy of a 6-year-old? Basiago believes there is only one answer.
I think I must have teleported. Imagine traveling through the Lincoln Tunnel in New York City at 10,000 miles per hour without any automobile around you. That's sort of what it was like. We were physically moving through a vortal tunnel in the fabric of time-space.
Had Andrew's father, Frank, invented the world's first teleportation machine? And if so, why? Frank Basiago was no ordinary dad. During the Cold War, the US and Soviets raced for military superiority. Frank was head of a top-secret American research team who were conducting experiments into teleportation. But why did Frank use his son as a guinea pig?
I think my dad's immediate goal in inviting me to teleport was to show that if teleportation was safe for his son, it was safe for anybody's child. And I was in it as a child, just as, for example, a child may have been aboard, one of Columbus's boats, or may have been an office boy to the Wright brothers, or an assistant to Thomas Alva Edison.
After the success of his experiment, Frank Basiago decides teleportation is too important to keep secret. He wants to tell the world, but the US military disagrees.
And so the unfortunate history of US teleportation is that it has remained essentially a military secret ever since.
40 years later, Andrew is on a mission. He believes teleportation technology is vitally important. His father's invention should be available to all of us.
Today, I'm leading the Truth Campaign. I'm urging the United States government to declassify teleportation, to allow people to teleport between major world cities. The way I see it, I have a duty simply to stand in my truth and tell the truth about what happened, because this was clearly an important epoch in the history of applied science. This was the moment when our human civilization on Earth became a time-space faring civilization. And so I'm speaking out primarily because I feel I have an historical duty to inform humanity that time-space emerged in this context in the late 60s and early 1970s, and that in the 21st century, we may need to use teleportation to solve the crisis of environment and development. So I'm speaking out also simply with the hope that if we can declassify and deploy teleportation, we can use it to actively advantage humanity in the 21st century.
Did Frank Basiago invent a machine that could instantly transport us across the world, or even to other dimensions? Is teleportation possible?
I wouldn't like to be the first one to be teleported. I would worry to end up maybe like a Picasso painting.
A boy enters a teleportation machine and is suddenly transported thousands of miles in seconds. Is human teleportation possible? Raymond Laflamme is a physicist. He thinks the idea we can teleport our bodies is simply fantasy.
It seems that the laws of physics are more constrained than the imagination of human beings. The first idea that we have when we think about teleportation is the Star Trek idea. Beam me up, Scotty. The idea of taking a person suddenly disintegrate in some form and reappearing up in a space station. Now, this is something that happens in science fiction.
But incredibly, although Laflamme dismisses the idea that people can teleport, he does believe it can happen in other ways, because he was one of the first scientists to do it.
We're not teleporting matter from one location to the other. We're really teleporting information.
Wait a second. Teleporting information? How is that any different than sending an email?
When we send an email, or even when we talk on our cell phone, the information goes from the sender through the intervening space to a receiver.
Remarkably, La Flamme has been able to teleport information without it traveling through any device at all.
What has been teleported is one quantum bit of information, or qubit, is sent from one location to the other. It has happened in nuclear magnetic resonance, where the information has gone from one atom of a molecule to another one. But it has also appeared in optics, where people have put information or quantum information in a particle of light called photons, send it to another location a few kilometers away, and then made it reappear over there. We've been able to teleport a few kilometers, taking one particle of information and make it reappear a few kilometers down the line. We've been able to do this.
It works like this. In the world of quantum physics, even the tiniest particles are somehow connected, even across huge distances. In quantum teleportation, such entangled particles can literally be in two places at once.
Absolutely amazing that we can teleport. In quantum teleportation, it seems to disappear here and reappear there. It looks like a piece of magic, a piece which we're not used to. Once we have technology based on quantum entanglement, on quantum teleportation, maybe we'll think it's very familiar and banal, but today for us, it looks something very unusual.
This technology could soon be used to instantly communicate with spaceships, no matter how far away. Or send military communications that are impossible to intercept.
We're just at the beginning of understanding what is quantum teleportation, how it works.
We may be able to teleport information, but does Andrew Basiago's story mean we can do it to ourselves? La Flamme thinks not.
You must have a secret that I do not have to be able to do this. But I wouldn't like to be the first one to be teleported. I would worry to end up maybe like a Picasso painting.
If human teleportation isn't possible, what happened to Andrew Basiago? Was his incredible journey just a figment of childhood imagination? Bruce Goldberg is a hypnotherapist. He thinks stories like Andrew's are very real.
We have ancient literature going back thousands of years with people who've teleported. There are a lot of religious cases, but there are also secular cases too. I think teleportation exists.
But how? Goldberg believes he's discovered the secret.
Teleportation is a very complex mechanism, and basically what happens is it's very similar in the beginning to out-of-body experiences where you might feel like a buzzing sound or a tingly feeling. Very often people feel a pop over the left ear, a popping sound, okay? And then they're going to feel a rush and a feeling of spiraling upwards. Now remember, from their perspective, they don't notice any difference. They feel these feelings, but people, to observe them objectively, would see them actually disappearing. Just they're there 1 second and they're not there the next. So they have this spiraling upward feeling. Their perspective when they're going through the teleportation is very narrowed. It's almost like you're looking through a keyhole. Their perspective gets very, very strange for a few moments, and then they arrive at the location where they designed to be. This tingling feeling, the buzzing, the spiraling upward sensation of a rush, of an energy rush, are characteristics of both teleportation and out-of-body experience. The difference here is the keyhole effect is limited to the teleportation, and of course the physical body moves from one location to another. I first discovered teleportation while working with patients. People would describe disappearing from one location. One gentleman went from New York City to Paris in an instant. I mean, he disappeared. His wife was sitting in the same room and telling me, yeah, my husband disappeared. I don't know where he went, and I was right there.
At first, Goldberg doubted his patients.
So then I started doing research about the teleportation cases. These are psychologically stable people. I know them, I know the families, and they weren't on drugs, okay?
But as he continued his research, Goldberg's patients began to describe their teleportation experiences in remarkable detail. And they all had one thing in common.
You see first just a little bit like tunnel vision, and then all of a sudden you appear whole. The people look exactly like we do. Some of the people that I meet are recognizable. I know who they are.
Incredibly, the people they encountered were replicas of themselves. The hauntingly similar experiences led Goldberg to a stunning insight.
When you teleport, you leave this universe and move into a parallel universe. Parallel universes are sister universes that exist alongside ours. Your DNA is exactly the same in your parallel life as it is here.
Are Goldberg's patients somehow being sucked into parallel dimensions and then meeting their own doppelgangers?
Now this is getting really crazy. Is there more than one Bill? Is there more than one you? Sounds nuts, right? Incredibly, physicists believe that these identical copies of ourselves might exist. Now, I don't really understand how this is possible, but if the eggheads say the math works, who am I to argue?
Do identical copies of each and every one of us exist in parallel worlds? Could we even enter those alternate realities? Bruce Goldberg believes the possibilities are staggering.
Let's say you have certain aspects of your life right now that you cannot change. Maybe you have an incurable disease. Maybe you have a criminal record. Maybe you've lost an arm. Well, in a parallel universe, that didn't exist. So instead of committing suicide or just going through life being depressed, you can actually switch universes and, in fact, have a much better life.
But if it really is possible to leap into a parallel world, why isn't everyone doing it?
Teleportation is hardly predictable. You can do this 1,000 times and you may get 1 or 2 examples. But future technology will be such that teleportation will be established by machines so people can control it and do it with regularity and predictability.
Could such technology already exist? Could Frank Basciago's dream still be alive?
I don't doubt there is some technology that can exist today where somebody can enter into this like a vortex and they can be teleported from one place to another.
Do we all exist in other dimensions? Do we possess machines that can teleport us from one world to another? Could Scotty really beam us up after all? Weird, or what? In Mexico, an explorer finds a strange skull made of pure crystal. Is it a gateway to another world?
Crystal skulls are holographic.
You know, I love exploring. Nothing better than getting out and seeing what you can find amongst the wilds of nature. Oh, you hear that? You hear that? Sometimes you can find treasures beyond the imagination. But sometimes you find things you want to keep very secret.
In 1924, British adventurer Frederick Mitchell Hedges went in search of Mayan treasures in the tiny country of Belize in Central America. What he discovered is regarded by some as the most important archaeological relic ever found. A perfectly formed human skull made from crystal. Carved with flawless precision, this 2,000-year-old artifact baffled scientists. Many believe the technology that created it couldn't have existed in ancient or even modern times. So what was it? And where did it come from? Remarkably, the answer could lie in an ancient Mayan legend that speaks of not one, but 13 crystal skulls that have extraordinary powers. It's a legend that could be based in fact. In 1994, amateur archaeologist Nick Nocerino found another perfect life-size skull, impeccably carved in clear crystal in Guerrero, Mexico. Kirby Seed is a crystal and mineral expert. In 1995, the Guerrero skull came into his care. As he began to study it, something weird happened.
And it began to show me pictures of past lives. It showed me images of possible futures that I could try to achieve for. And those pictures turned into visions. Those visions, I see people moving, I see objects moving, there's motion in those visions. And suddenly I feel like I've popped into that particular reality. And I feel like I'm merging my energy with its energy.
But Kirby believes this skull has many other powers. The greatest of all is the ability to open doors to another world.
Crystal skulls are holographic. They contain all the points of time and space. We know in modern physics theory, in string theory, that there are at least 11 dimensions. Skulls are portals to other dimensions and parallel worlds.
Do crystal skulls possess strange powers that can take us to other dimensions? Or is there another answer to this mystery?
Well, to my mind, there's not really a mystery surrounding them.
A man believes an ancient crystal skull can communicate with parallel worlds. Do these strange, mysterious objects have powers beyond our comprehension?
Well, to my mind, there's not really a mystery surrounding them.
Jane Walsh is an anthropologist at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. She believes crystal skulls aren't quite as magical as they seem.
I've essentially concluded that none of the skulls I have looked at have really anything to do with pre-Columbian Mexico. Mostly they were marketed to deceive.
Jane has examined 9 crystal skulls, including the one discovered by Mitchell Hedges. Due to the nature of the crystal, it's not possible to determine when the skulls were made. But Jane believes there's another way to unearth the skull's secrets. Using liquid silicone, she can find out how they were made.
The silicone sort of flows in nicely to all of the crevices. Make sure it's going into all of the carved areas.
Once the silicone is dry, Jane has a highly accurate mold of the markings on the skull surface. Using an electron microscope, these can be magnified over 10 million times.
As those electrons strike the surface of the sample, we're going to generate a signal. We'll get a topographical image of the surface of the sample. And we get great spatial resolution. We see very good detail. We can see a lot of things that we wouldn't be able to see otherwise.
One thing in particular was remarkable. Evidence that the perfect crystal skulls weren't quite as perfect as they seemed.
What you're seeing there is the edge of a rotary disc cutting tool.
If you imagine some guy sitting here doing this, trying to drill this little hole, we're not going to have this little path that cuts. You can follow it all the way around.
Jane's analysis is damning. She believes whoever made the skulls had access to modern power tools.
We know the sorts of tools that were used by pre-Columbian lapidaries, which was essentially a Stone Age toolkit. They probably used copper with abrasive sand, perhaps in drilling and cutting, but essentially they used stone to carve stone. So looking at some of the skulls, it's very apparent that hard metal with permanently adhered diamond abrasives were used to cut them. So with the Mitchell Hedges skull, we were able to find some of the initial carving that was done by very tiny, high-speed dentist-type drills. That's simply not a tool that any Mayan or Aztec would have had.
So, if the skulls are not ancient Mayan or Aztec, when were they carved?
They probably are about as old as when they first appeared. It's certainly true of this skull. We know it was purchased in 1960 in Mexico, and it was polished and carved with an abrasive that wasn't available until after World War II. So probably it was made in the 1950s. The British Museum skull was probably made not too long before it first appeared on the art market, which was the early 1880s. All of them were created by using quite modern tools.
Are the crystal skulls simply an elaborate hoax? Does the harsh light of Jane's microscope mean we should dismiss those who believe they have mystical powers?
I would love it if someone would excavate one, a recognized archaeologist, but I'm not holding my breath.
Is the legend of 13 all-powerful crystal skulls nothing more than fanciful bunkum? Or do they have powers beyond comprehension? Could Kirby Seed be right? Are they gateways to other dimensions? Joshua Shapiro is an explorer. He not only believes crystal skulls can connect us to other worlds, but they were given to us by beings who live in them.
What I believe is the connection between the crystal skulls and, let's say, other intelligences which may come from parallel worlds or other dimensions. These beings, I believe, brought the crystal skulls in physical form to humanity a very long time ago. They brought them as tools to help us to grow and to understand who we really are, which I believe is divine souls. I believe all of us are divine beings. But when we incarnate as a human being, we forget the essence of who we are. So these parallel worlds are trying to help us to remember this, and what they will do occasionally at different points in history, and again, this is my theory, and I think there are other people involved in the crystal skulls who believe this, is that they bring tools that act as a catalyst to awaken us.
Did crystal skulls arrive from parallel worlds in ancient times? And if so, how do these other dimensional beings use them as doorways to connect with humans? Shapiro thinks it all comes down to what they're made of.
The crystal skulls act as portals or dimensional doors because quartz crystal has the ability to exist in many different dimensions simultaneously. It's the property of the material itself. It just lends itself to working with energy on different vibrational frequencies. So that's why it's a perfect conduit.
Quartz crystal vibrating frequencies across multiple dimensions. Crazy talk, right? Well, in fact, crystals have been used in communication devices like radios for nearly a century. They can be tuned to vibrate at specific frequencies, which allows them to tune in broadcasts. So maybe a crystal skull could be an interdimensional telephone after all.
Quartz crystal is one of the most important materials on the planet, but to put it into the shape of a human bone skull, those two combined make them very special. So these other intelligences can use the crystal skull to communicate with us.
So are crystal skulls portals for messages from other dimensions? And if so, what are they trying to convey?
If I could define in one sentence what the crystal skulls are, they are a mirror and a catalyst to awaken humanity. If we as individuals would just be open to all the amazing phenomena that's going on in our world instead of trying to rationalize it, I think that our planet would be at peace much quicker, and we would learn a lot more about ourselves, and we would have additional assistance coming that we could not even imagine.
Do crystal skulls have the ability to create electrical signals that allow us to interact with other dimensions? Or are they simply harmless hunks of polished rock? Is there any scientific evidence that gateways to other worlds even exist at all?
What an incredible story. Can this skull generate vibrations that allow us to speak to people in parallel worlds? Can you imagine what we could achieve if we could harness the power within this magnificent, priceless object? Oh! Can we get another one?
A mysterious crystal skull discovered in Mexico is believed to be a doorway to another dimension. Could this be possible? Dr. Paul Stevenson studies extreme physics at the University of Surrey. He thinks the idea of a portal to a distant world is quite plausible.
One possible way we could at least theoretically think about opening a door to another world or a portal to somewhere else comes from black holes.
Astronomers once believed that everything in a black hole was crushed into a single point of infinite mass called a singularity. But recently, some have proposed another idea.
It's conceivable that you'd make some kind of portal from one part of the universe to another that you could actually travel through, and that would be called a wormhole. According to Einstein's theory of relativity, heavy objects will tend to warp space. And you can kind of think of that as if space was some kind of stretched rubber sheet, and you put a very heavy thing on, it's going to make a depression in the sheet. And that's something like our sun would make a depression in this rubber sheet. And you imagine sort of rolling a ball along, it will sort of have to bend around the sun because of the way the sheet's been depressed. And that's kind of what happens, say, when a comet sort of slingshots around the sun. Now, in the case of a black hole, I have a kind of model here to show the sort of depression you might get in space with something like a black hole or a star would be in this depression here. The special thing about a black hole is that this depression goes on and on forever. And if something gets caught in it, it'll just go down and be lost. Now, what happens with a wormhole is you would end up having two black holes connected together, something like that. So you can sort of imagine that if you fell in one end of the black hole, you could come out the other end. And so theoretically, this thing could exist. We haven't ever seen one, but there's no reason, based on our understanding of physics, why something like this couldn't happen.
And if we can create a sort of tunnel to other parts of our universe, what does that mean for parallel dimensions?
Now, it may not be a big leap to suggest that we could create a wormhole that connects us to different dimensions or a different universe.
According to Paul, in theory, it's possible to create a pathway to other worlds. It's nothing anyone's ever seen before. So how does he know it could happen?
But they're actually based on solid physics and solid science. And we've certainly come across lots of things in the past that at first sight seem to be utterly ridiculous or completely fantastical and have turned out to be true. I don't know whether that's going to turn out to be the case for wormholes, whether we'll ever see one, but it's certainly not beyond the bounds of reason.
Could we open cosmic gateways into parallel worlds and communicate with them with crystal skulls? Or can we simply teleport our bodies there whenever we wish? Are shadow people from other dimensions already amongst us? Weird. What? So there we have it. Stories of parallel worlds from all over the planet. In New York, a woman has a terrifying encounter with a human-shaped shadow. Did it come from another dimension? In New Jersey, a weird machine transports a boy and his father hundreds of miles in a split second. Did they teleport to a different world? And in Mexico, a team makes an amazing discovery. A skull made of crystal. Is it a doorway to a parallel universe? Are these stories evidence that parallel worlds exist? Can we dismiss the claims of those who believe they are true? You decide.
Join me again next time for more stories that will undoubtedly be weird or what.